Oh hey, today is a very exciting day for me because after around 10 years I finally got my NES out of storage so I can finally replay some of my old NES games. I'm here with my good friend Nessie in order to play some of these old games. I mean, he's been in storage for like 10 years, look how excited he is. So the NES was the first game console I ever collected for. After watching a lot of angry video game nerd YouTube videos back in 2010, I got really into collecting for the NES. And after about a year of owning it, I just kinda stopped playing it because it's not very good. But So, let's play some of these games and see if they are as good as I remember them. Alright, let's pop him in. Get in there, stop squirming! It's usually a lot easier than this. I also remember there being a lot less blood. When a lot of people start collecting retro video games, they often begin collecting the Nintendo Entertainment System, me included. But why? Why should that be the starting point? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The NES is Nintendo's first console, so that is why it should obviously be the starting point. Well, no, because Game & Watches came out before the NES. Fine, but it's still their first home console. But that's also wrong. Where are you getting this information, other me? Nintendo released like 6 consoles before the NES. Granted, they didn't take cartridges and were mostly just used for playing Pong. And yeah, they were only released in Japan, but they're still technically Nintendo's first home console. Well, people start by collecting the NES because that's where most of Nintendo's first party series began. Games like Kid Icarus and The Legend of Zelda and Metroid all started life on the NES. Mario technically started life in arcades, but you can't really put a Donkey Kong or Mario Bros arcade machine on a shelf. So yeah, the NES seems like the most reasonable place to start. Say for example you really liked The Legend of Zelda and you wanted to start at the very beginning. Beginning in terms of release, as Skyward Sword is the first place to start story-wise. But anyway, I bought the original Legend of Zelda back in 2010 and started playing it and got my sword and then made no progress at all. You start off the game really weak, the enemies are really powerful, you have no idea where you're supposed to be going, most of the integral secrets to the game are impossible to work out. Like, how was I know to burn this random bush? Then after a few attempts of roaming around this world until I got a game over, I then found out I could get an improved version of the game on Game Boy Advance. So then went back to eBay and bought that, and then slowly followed a YouTube walkthrough until I finished the game. So yeah, playing The Legend of Zelda for the first time isn't the most fun experience. And I'd go as far to say that if you don't really know what you're getting into, starting off by playing these kinds of games could put you off playing old games for life. Like, I started off with an NES and then went backwards to an Atari 2600, which is just this. And as a result of this and not really enjoying my experience, I didn't pick up a Super Nintendo for another 10 years. I originally bought an NES and then over the course of around a year picked up around 20 games for it. Games that were well known, games that I picked up from my retro game shop for cheap, and some of them I enjoyed well enough, but I didn't really have any nostalgia for these games. Like, a lot of the people who were buying these games at the time were people who grew up with them. People who were familiar with the culture surrounding them. Like, they still knew the Metroid map off by heart because they drew the map out, or remembered the Contra code from reading it in a magazine, or remembering how they'd heard from some kid on the playground that some kid had a game called Abadox, where the final boss has her nips out, and that one is true. But yeah, I didn't have that at the time. If anything, playing it now, I feel more nostalgic than I did at the time, because I now remember first playing these games 10 years ago. But I can't deny it anymore, the games themselves aren't very good. And collecting them now might just not be a good idea. So let's start with the basics. Say that you're committed to collecting for the NES. Are you just planning on collecting the cartridges? Because the instruction manuals are pretty important to a lot of these games. NES games rarely give you any of the story actually in the game, and they certainly don't give you tutorials to try and teach you how to play the actual thing. All of this stuff used to be in the instruction manual. And oftentimes those can cost just as much as the actual cartridge. And if you think, well, I can always just Google the instruction manual, then why not just Google the actual game? As you're still not really getting an authentic experience. And then when you do start collecting NES games, how many do you believe that you'll be able to get through? Because no matter what you're told, NES games aren't nearly as short as you might believe. Like, back then, Nintendo expected you to have very few games for the system, and they knew that there wasn't a lot of game in there. So game companies would use every trick they could to artificially elongate that experience. Like, I have well over 1,000 games now, and I don't have time to dedicate to learning the endless repeating corridors in Metroid. And I certainly don't have time to draw them all out. I don't have the patience to learn where every enemy is going to spawn in Mega Man, and learn the attack patterns of the bosses. A lot of NES games, and in fact a lot of SNES games too, could just be unreasonably difficult at times. So if you do get one of these systems, I highly recommend getting a Game Genie. It's a cheat device where you plug your game into it and then enter a code to get things like infinite lives, which I think is just a feature every game should have. Don't make me repeat levels I've already done just because I'm not good at a later level. And I am not ashamed to admit that I couldn't beat Donkey Kong Country without a Game Genie. This isn't a problem though with things like emulation or Switch Online, as you can use save states and the rewind feature to make the game a lot easier. If you die, you can just rewind until you weren't dead, which just isn't something you can do when playing on original hardware. And even when you've finally defeated the boss that you were struggling with for ages, and finally make it to the next level, you better be prepared to just carry on going and complete that game, because most of these games don't give you the ability to save. Sure, some of them give you passwords, but it's not the same. It's not the same. And sure, back in the 80s you could leave your NES on all night and come back to it the next day. But nowadays I have to remember to switch it off, unplug the adapter, and make it a fancy dinner for fear of it just deciding now is its time. And believe me, these NESs are not invincible. I had to buy a second one a few months after buying my first. Then recently, when I tried to open it up to see if I could fix my original, I found a 40-year-old spider corpse all curled up inside it. And yes, some games like Zelda and Kirby have the ability to save, but that save feature relied on a watch battery, which will be long dead by now. So you better be prepared to solder in a new battery onto the circuit board for each game if you ever want to be able to use that feature again. As for the graphics, look, I'm going to be honest with you, they're not good. The NES could produce 256 colours, whereas the SNES could do nearly 33,000 colours. Admittedly, the NES's 256 colours is still better than the Game Boy's one colour, mucus green. It also looks a lot better than the Atari 2600. In Atari games, you usually just controlled a Lego brick running into other Lego bricks. So the NES was definitely a step up from that. But the SNES just perfected the style to the point that it made NES graphics a little redundant. We still get loads of indie games coming out with SNES inspired graphics, but very few with NES inspired ones. Also, NES games had so many other graphical quirks, like the flickering in games like Kirby's Adventure. That game was re-released on 3DS with stereoscopic 3D and no flickering, so why would you ever play the NES version over that? Even all of the original Mario games were remade with improvements on the SNES, so really, why would you ever go back to the NES ones? Ignoring all the other stuff I've already said, one of, if not the main reason to not collect for the NES, has to be that it only relies on SCART or aerial out, which means that it won't work on modern TVs. You could use an adapter, but that only makes the games look worse than they already do. And then there's accessories like the Zapper or Rob the Robot, which just won't work on a new TV, even with an adapter, because these games rely on reading light signals from an old CRT TV. So you better add a CRT TV to your shopping list. But then a lot of those old TVs have the insulating putty worn away, causing the TVs to now make a high-pitched noise that will slowly drive you insane. And my old CRT TV for some reason flashes while using the NES because the frequency is too low or something. I'm not too sure, but according to Reddit this is a pretty common problem. And I couldn't figure out how to fix it other than just turn the brightness down really low. But it gives me epilepsy just thinking about playing games on this thing. Now, if you don't actually plan on playing the games but are just getting into collecting for the NES because you think of it as an investment, then believe me, that ship has sailed, no matter what Water wants you to believe. Your copy of Super Mario Bros. Is not going to be worth $1 million. In fact, the prices for NES games have pretty much plateaued. Sure, the really expensive little Samson type games might continue to rise, but your average collector buying games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Kid Icarus really aren't going to see those games getting any more expensive. And NES games aren't really the kind of things that you find at garage sales or boot fairs for a couple pennies anymore. It's been 40 years. No old lady is finding a box of NES games in her attic anymore and selling them off cheap. My copy of Lemmings hasn't risen in the past 12 years since I bought it, and I doubt it ever will. If you're gonna invest in games, invest in something newer where the prices are still rising and you can still get a good deal on it. Something like the Wii U. Actually, don't do that, as I explained in this video here. The truth is, for me at least, these games aren't fun to play. They don't look good and they often don't work. But in spite of all this, in spite of me making a YouTube video now telling you about how bad NES games are, despite the fact that you can play them on Nintendo Switch Online now for free with like 1,000,000 improvements, I'm still gonna buy NES games. And that's because
I just think they're neat.
They're a fun piece of history and they're cool to have on a shelf. Just don't ever play them. So that's the truth of it. I'm just really conflicted about whether or not I like the NES or not. If you're getting into collecting the NES, then I recommend first getting a few of these for the Switch and playing Nintendo Switch Online to see if you like the games, to see, the best way of playing them, I'd say. Also, I would say that this book is a must-have if you're getting into collecting for the NES. It's the NES Anthology, and it gives
I am going to kill him.
Very detailed history on the creation of the NES, all the accessories, a review of every single NES game released, all the different variants in the different regions. It's just a really cool book to have. There are also a lot of games that I still want to get for the NES, like Castlevania. That's probably highest on my list at the moment. So if you are going to collect for the NES, just be aware that the console does have its flaws.
Die, die, die. Stop squirming, go to sleep.